Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. As I say every week, thanks to you, the TNT Show and Indie Live are growing and delivering more exciting shows. I hope you'll support them by checking out the Crowdfunder. And for example, you can watch the TNT Show on IndieLive.net. It's streamed out on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, on YouTube, you can view all of more than 170 shows that we broadcast already. Now, many would say that the fourth estate in Scotland is mostly fourth rate. So, if you're upset by media coverage of political events, where journalism is often junked in favour of stenography or rehashed press releases, or worse, when conjecture and hearsay replace facts, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. Now's your chance, if you wouldn't mind, to be here for us. Support the Crowdfunder. Why not start with a donation of, say, £5? And you'll find the details on the screen. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. The Prime Minister, who many might have thought speaks for the whole country, has labelled independence supporters as extremists, adding them to a sorry list that includes anti-Semites and terrorists across the world. He point-blank refuses to apologise, even though his staff have removed the offending passages from the written record of his remarks. So somebody somewhere must have found them offensive, and yet he persists. Maybe it's the mark of the man. Maybe he just doesn't have that moral backbone which great politicians have and is needed, which is to say, hey, mea culpa, but you know something, but none of that. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to repeat the invitation to Alaba MSP Ash Regan to appear on the show. Come on, Ash, and give Scotland your point of view. Tonight we'll be talking to a special guest, Olaf Stando. Now, he will be discussing Europe, independence, the media, and much else besides. So this is one of these unique opportunities where you get a chance to explore some of these very exciting topics, because whatever happens, independence in Europe, I would suggest to you, are inevitably and indelibly linked together. The question is how that all works. And he will be taking your questions live, so there's still time to put a question. You'll find the details on the screen. As you know, the TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So this is your opportunity to participate. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight. Thanks for joining us, Olaf. How are you?
Hello, and to my fellow independence extremist, John. It's great to be here.
It's a great pleasure to have you. I want to kick off, if I may, by asking you to talk about what's happening at the weekend and why it's important.
So this weekend, we've got a really exciting international conference happening in Stirling at the Hotel Colascio. It's the international conference about Scotland's future in Europe, and it brings together young Scots under the age of 30, as well as people of all ages from all across Scotland, and crucially, international youth delegations from 9 different countries, right? So I'm the international officer at the YSI. I've been doing that job since 2022. It's not a job, it's voluntary, by the way. And what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to build up a network of supporters for Scotland's independence abroad. There's obviously lots of other groups as well that are doing similar work. There's Germans for Scottish independence. There's Netherlands for Scottish independence. There's marches planned, I think, in the next few months. There's Europe for Scotland. I want to bring all these efforts together and cultivate, in particular, among young people in Europe, the future leaders of Europe, the politicians of tomorrow, support for Scottish independence. So we're bringing them to Stirling. We have 30 international youth leaders coming and about 50 YSI activists. So that's the youth wing of the SNP activists. So around about 100 people in total, as well as some extra people over the age of 30. But it's a youth-led conference. It's all about the future of Scotland and Europe. It's all about exploring what is that path? How do we get back into Europe, and why is it so important? And once we're actually in Europe as an independent state, what do we want to do as an independent state? What are our priorities? And that's what we're going to be talking about on Friday and Saturday in Stirling.
Sounds exciting. If somebody who hasn't heard about it and is only hearing about it now, can they still come along and participate?
They can, yeah. So we've still got a couple of spots available. I can put the registration link later on in the chat, or I can send it to the producer, and maybe you can share it in the chat. But if you just Google Our European Future 2024, or if you go on the Young Scots for Independence social media, so if you go on Instagram or Twitter from Young Scots for Independence, you will be able to see the link for registration, and you can come along on Friday the 17th and Saturday the 18th at Hotel Colegio in Stirling.
Sounds exciting. How did the people who are coming from overseas, how were they qualified to be invited? Did they really express an interest in independence, or are they completely neutral?
It's a mixture of things. So what I've been trying to do since I took over as international officer at the YSI is broaden the sort of people that we talk to, because traditionally the SNP has always been very close to our friends in Catalonia, to our friends in Wales, to our friends in Basque Country, and we are absolutely close to them still. We're not abandoning them whatsoever. I think the Catalan cause is very closely tied to the Scottish cause, and it must remain so. But what I've tried to do as well is to think about, all right, how do we squeeze out the sympathy for Scotland as a result of Brexit? There's a lot of social democrats and there's a lot of other progressive parties in Europe that are appalled by Brexit and see that Scotland has been frankly screwed over by David Cameron and Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and the like. And how do we squeeze out that sympathy and bring them to Scotland to educate them and to instill the sense that Scotland needs a right to choose? So I've been doing a bit of outreach for the past 2 years, just speaking to lots of international youth party leaders, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. There is still a lot of social democrat youth parties which are closely tied to Labour in the UK. And even though they're sympathetic to Scotland, they don't want to talk to us because we're not Labour. But there are some, and in particular the Germans and the Danes, so that's the youth wings of the German and Danish Social Democrat parties, they have actually come around to supporting Scotland's right to choose. So they're not backing independence per se. I mean, it's not really their decision. It's for Scotland to decide. But they're backing Scotland's right to choose. And I think it's so important that the people that are leading the youth wings of their parties, that might be politicians on a big level in a couple of years, we're creating that new generation of people that can be advocating for Scotland's cause.
Yeah, I think that's terribly important. I mean, people seem to forget sometimes that the people they see on the screens as political leaders were once in exactly the position that you're describing. They were interested. I mean, Bill Clinton came to the UK. I mean, it's maybe not the best example, but there's a tendency for people who tend to aspire to leadership roles. They want to try and know about organizations and countries outside of their own, because it means that when they go back and talk in their own countries, they're talking meaningfully.
Exactly. Imagine this, right? I mean, I want this conference to produce concrete outcomes. I don't just want it to be a talking shop. What I want is that when they go home on Sunday and they've had a really fruitful weekend of conversations with over 20 senior speakers across the SNP. We've got Angus Robertson, the Constitution Secretary, coming to speak. We've got Neil Gray, the Health Secretary. We've got Colcap Stewart, the former Minister for Europe and Minister for Equalities. We've got a lot of senior SNP people that are there to listen to them directly and to advocate our vision. We've got people like Leslie Riddick coming as well. We've got Laura Webster, the editor of The National. So a whole spectrum of pro-independence activists.
Yeah.
And I want them to come back, the international activists to come back and put motions to their party conferences, for example, about, Scotland's right to choose. I want them to learn from Scotland in terms of policy. Look, the Scottish government hasn't got a lot of things right always, but the Scottish government has transformed Scotland with devolution, right? A lot good has happened. So, if you think about stuff like the Scottish Child Payment, if you think about the stuff like the renewable energy transformation that we've got, all of this is stuff that they can learn and bring to their countries as well. So I think we want to learn from them as well. There's a lot of great things that the Danes, for example, are doing in housing. There's a lot of great things that the Germans are doing when it comes to transport. So we want to exchange in terms of policy. We want to build that confidence in Scotland as a modern, progressive, internationalist nation. And, hopefully these connections will last a long time.
Oh, you like to hope so. And we've had a question, which is that, have you sent out a news release and do you expect the media to turn up?
We have, So we've sent out a press release like last week. The National are an official partner of this conference. So the National have actually been helping us out with promotion. And you'll see this Friday, if you subscribe to the National, there's going to be an 8-page special edition. And there's also an article from me in the National tomorrow about the conference. So they've been covering it, and they're bringing journalists to the conference to do some live coverage. Obviously, because this is a pro-independence conference, and because it's about the movement talking kind of to itself, well, not to itself and to other countries, other media just weren't interested. I would imagine that the likes of the Daily Record, for example, would not want to admit the fact that Labour-aligned international parties, Social Democrats that were traditionally aligned with Labour, are coming to engage with us instead, because that's a sense of defeat, isn't it? But we've got the National, we've got Broadcasting Scotland coming as well on Saturday. Of course, we also have Independence Live as well. So we're in discussions at the moment with Kevin and Jem and Jason from Independence Live, who will be coming hopefully to live stream it as well. So keep a lookout on that.
That sounds good. So that means that people who are interested but can't attend can access the material online, which is great. It's super.
Absolutely. But if you can attend, right, I really just stress, do look at the Young Scots for Independence page on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter, because there is a link to there. It's totally free to attend. It's Friday and Saturday. We've still got about 15 spots left. It's going to be quite a busy event. It's quite a big venue. But if you want to come, just sign up. There's a link on the...
There you are, folks. There's still places you can get along there. If you want to talk about Europe, if you want to be interested in international matters, and you want to influence how international groups view Scotland, then you've got an opportunity here. I want to ask you a question, but before I do so, can I just extend our sympathies to the family and friends of the Robert Fico, the Slovak Prime Minister, who was shot today. It's very sad news, and obviously we hope he recovers. A question I want to ask you, and it's a question I'm asked by people internationally all the time. They say, we feel that you guys are right. We feel you have a real strong case to make. So they're sold on the whole idea of choosing. But they feel that Scotland is very non-assertive. In other words, they look at things and they say, why do you let Westminster do this? Why do you let Westminster do that? You stand up and make speeches, but you don't actually do anything concrete. For example, the Secretary of State for Scotland has said very recently that he has recommended to the Secretary of State for Energy that there be a nuclear power station in Scotland. Now, this is completely in opposition to the views of most Scots. And yet all I hear is, well, we don't think that's a good idea. No, it's a damn bad idea. And what are you going to do to stop it? That's what my foreign friends would say. People in Catalonia, for example, would say, I can't imagine the Spanish government saying, we're going to build a power station against your wishes in Barcelona. It would be unheard of. They might.
Well, they did send police to beat up people for voting in 2017.
Oh, that's true, but that's because there's a constitutional prohibition on impacting the integrity of the Spanish state. So that would be unconstitutional. But that isn't the case in Scotland. There is no written constitution of the type that Catalans or Spanish people would recognise. And so therefore there's enormous scope to say, look, I'm going to do what Westminster does. I shall make up the constitution as I go along. And so what? You have to test it in the courts. So what? What you do at every stage is to say, don't meddle with me. Don't make these assertions, because there will be consequences.
I think, look, the movement is in a difficult spot. Let's be honest. We've been through a lot. And, the past 16 months have been chaos, and the Unionist parties, in particular Labour, have exploited our weakness. I think we've not been assertive enough. We've not been strategic enough. We haven't had a strategy that was cutting through and that was actually easy to understand. So I think there's a lot of barriers facing the movement. And, I speak as an activist, but I also speak as an SNP member, and as someone who desperately wants independence, because I see every single day that for every day that we're not independent, we've got folk being pushed into poverty. We've got, inadequate action on climate. We've got, the impact of Brexit, which we never voted for. We've got ridiculous and shameful international law-breaking schemes like Rwanda. So, we can't afford not to be independent. But the question is, how do we get there? And that's frankly down to the politicians to figure it out and to have a strategy that's coherent and that brings the movement along. But it's also down to the movement to keep pushing and keep plugging away and be strategic as well. Because I think the movement a lot of the time has been talking to itself, has been navel gazing, has been divided. Let's be honest, that there's a lot of acrimony between the SNP, ALBA, the Greens, other parties. I think we need to end that acrimony, and regardless of our political views, which have always been broad, right? We're a broad church, and rightly so. I think Scotland is a very diverse politically country, but we just need to put that behind us. We need to get active, and whether it's organising yourself in your Yes group and actually organising events, which don't just talk to yourself, but talk to other people, talk to the unconvinced, right? Whether it's turning up to marches in force, because let's be honest, the marches have been pretty sparsely attended, or whether it's, being innovative, talking more about policy, talking about what does independence actually mean for ordinary folk in terms of, bread and butter issues. Why don't we keep talking about independence as the only way to grow our economy, the only way to stop poverty, the only way to, to be heard and to get the governments that we want, and not Liz Truss and other assorted lettuces, right? So I think we have to get back to basics and also get a bit smarter.
There is a view that's growing. I wouldn't say it was a majority view by any means. It's certainly a minority view. That this is actually a good time to lose an election, in the sense of watching the Labour Party capture some more seats, because Labour is almost bound to fail because it's using the same policies as the present Conservative government. So it's bound to fail because these have failed. And to watch the collapse of Labour over the next couple of years, you couldn't ever see anyone reverting back to Tories. So therefore, the likelihood is that SNP will have a free space to move into in 2 years' time when the Labour government collapses. And you could say that, hey, that would be in our best interest. Thinking about it strategically. I mean, you'd have to have a plan to exploit that. But that is, I mean, if people were blue skying the situation right now, they would say, I suspect, make suggestions like that.
Look, I mean, as an SNP member and an SNP activist, I'm never going to advocate for the SNP to lose the election, right? I'm certainly never going to see myself voting Labour, not least because where I live in the Kirkcaldy constituency in sunny Fife, we've had a Labour candidate suspended for a whole parade of, anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic, conspiracist views. Wilma Brown, Gordon Brown's own pick, was suspended just a couple of weeks ago for just a tirade of disgusting views. And she was replaced by a parachute candidate from London who tried to stand in the constituency of Beckenham in London just a couple of weeks ago, didn't get in, so she's trying Kirkcaldy instead. So I think, I think voting Labour is an insult to common sense, frankly. But look, I think the SNP has to just rebuild. And I genuinely think we have an exciting opportunity now with John Swinney and Kate Forbes working as a team, bringing different strands of the party, the continuity and the fresh face together. They have to reach out to the independence movement as well. They have to work collaboratively across party lines. They have to show a clear, laser-focused vision on the economy, because a lot of people are talking about the economy and jobs and the sort of bread and butter issues, but then link it back to independence, right? Show that we're doing what we can at Hollywood. We're transforming people's lives, whether it's the Scottish Child Payment, whether it's, free bus travel. But imagine how much more we could do with independence, right? Imagine how much more we could do if we were a normal country that could borrow money, that could invest in critical infrastructure. We can't do any of that. We can't do any of that. And I think a lot of people that complain about Hollywood's record as well forget about just how little the Hollywood Parliament can actually do, because we're not a normal independent country. And a lot of areas that are devolved notionally, like social security, for example, most of the money is still held at Westminster. So while the Scottish Parliament can create new benefits, and they did, because they've created 13 benefits since establishing its own benefit system, right? And it's helping folk, it's lifting folk out of poverty. 85% of the money in terms of the social security system is held at Westminster through universal credit, which is very flawed. So I think they have to talk about, govern well, be competent, but always link back to independence.
I think the challenge, I mean, there's two challenges there. Somebody in the Labour Party listening to you will say, well, hold on a second, you're setting off to achieve exactly the opposite. That poor people in Durham have just as much right to all of the advantages that you say independence will bring for Scotland. Why split things and secede? All you've done is weakened the working class across the whole island by doing so.
Listen, I get it. I get what they mean, but you could also make the same point as, is Denmark being independent, or Ireland being independent, or Luxembourg being independent? Does that mean that you have no European solidarity? No, of course not. These countries are working together within the thing called the EU that Labour wants us to be out of, and working together to create solidarity between working class people. You can do that. You do not have to be tied to a failed Westminster London model, because that doesn't care about working class people, does it? I don't think that the people that hang out in Whitehall, all in the same postcode, the journalists, the establishment, the political class, I don't know. They don't care about the working class in Durham. They can say they do, but they don't. And I think the really important thing is again, just to demonstrate to people, we've got a plan for making life better. And we can take you with us on this journey. You can trust us. But think about how much more we can do. Imagine a better country, right? What really annoys me about, the Scottish society sometimes is that there's the Scottish cringe, right? It's still a very live thing. We don't like to believe in ourselves. We don't like to believe that we've got potential, because we're used to being told for decades that we just can't do it, right? Too wee, too small, too poor. And we have to get out of that mindset. I mean, we've been talking about this for 10 years, right? Since 2014. We still haven't gotten out of that mindset. We're still allowing ourselves to be talked down by Westminster and by the political establishment and the commentariat. So I think it is so, so important to just keep the focus, right? Don't get divided. Yes, Labour are doing well in the polls. Of course, Labour's probably going to take 10, 15 seats of the SNP. They're going to have a good night. But, keep your eyes on the prize. And when inevitably Starmer gets the keys to Downing Street, point out every single day just how much of a betrayer he is to not just the interests of the working class, but also the interests of Scotland and of anywhere that's not London.
Yeah, I would agree with much of that. I mean, but the reality is that structurally, the devolution is set up to fail. Well, it is, because power devolved is power retained. What it means is that I can give you power, but any moment, if I so choose, for whatever reason, I don't have to tell you, I can simply remove that power. I mean, for example, one of the first items on the so-called Smith Commission list after the 2014 referendum, number one, was that the Scottish Parliament should be permanent. That's impossible. I mean, and somebody in the SNP should have pointed that out. You cannot have two sovereign entities in the same land. You just can't. If Westminster is sovereign, then there's no way that Edinburgh can be permanent, because a sovereign is able to either instigate, introduce, or abolish that which it chooses. And that's a fact. And somebody somewhere should have pointed that out to the Scottish people and said, look, this commission is worthless, because it has not. And in fact, the reality was it failed. The Scottish Parliament is not permanent. It's not enshrined anywhere.
I think what the Smith Commission also said in 2014, right, is that the Scottish people have the right to self-determination. And in fact, even people like Theresa May and Boris Johnson, etc., were all admitting tacitly that Scotland has the right to self-determination. They were just saying now is not the time. But I think it is clear that Scotland does have that right. I think we have to keep pushing for that right and being more assertive to not just ask for that right, but to kind of take it into our hands. But I think, look, devolution is a good thing, right? Devolution is so frustrating because we're trying to make change with one hand tied behind our back while dragging a massive concrete ball up in one row, right? It's difficult. And it's made to be difficult. And a lot of the time, the Unionist parties and the Unionist press have a vested interest in devolution failing. And don't forget, Scottish Tories, obviously, until 20 years ago, so have been, opposed to the idea of a Scottish Parliament. There's some people within the Scottish Tory ranks who still don't want to see a Scottish Parliament. So And of course, we've got the Power Grab Bill, the Internal Markets Act, which has driven a coach and horses through this idea of an equal union, equal partners. Because, Westminster, through a sort of unelected Whitehall agency, can now veto and overrule laws passed by the Scottish Parliament. That's ridiculous. That cannot be allowed. But regardless of that, devolution is still a good thing. It's still an opportunity for us, for the SNP, to demonstrate that we can build a better country with the powers that we've got, govern well, deliver for the people, and show them that if we can do this, how much you could do with the powers of independence. That would probably make me a gradualist, in a sense that I think a lot of people in Scotland are not fundamental on the constitutional question. There's probably about 25%, 30% of people that are a hardline yes, dyed in the wool yes, and will never imagine voting a different way. There's probably about 25%, 30% of people that are hardline unionist and will never switch their allegiance. But that key 30, 40% in the middle are pragmatic, and they want to see progressive change for them. They want to see their lives made better. They want to believe in Scotland's potential. And the way we do that is, govern well, put trust that we're governing well, show ideas for governing better.
That's one way. That's one way. That's one way. There are a raft of different ways. History tells us. Anyone who's opened a history book knows that there's a whole range of ways that independence can be secured. And they're not about gradualism necessarily. It would be lovely, I agree with you, if we had willing partners on both sides who were happy to sit down together and say, look, this is something we both desire. That strikes me as hugely unlikely, let's put it that way. More likely is that you become such a nuisance that the other guy says, something, I hate to say this, but I really would like to see the back of you. And I'm thinking of a typical parallel. What happens if you go back to looking at the situation in the United States in 1775, you've got a bunch of people there. 25% of folks had a slight feeling for independence. The vast bulk of them regarded themselves as Englishmen, and right through the conflict described themselves as Englishmen. Even when they became independent, they still used the term from time to time. But the reality is that 25% became 60% because they provoked Westminster. They provoked King George. And they did it by daft things, throwing tea into Boston Harbour. I mean, silly, stupid thing to do. I mean, honestly.
But it sticks in memory. It sticks in memory. That's the point.
Could you justify it? You couldn't. But what they were saying was, we shouldn't be taxed in the way you've done it. And that simple device and the reaction of Westminster to that, indiscipline, if I can call it that, that overreaction generated that change from the people in the middle of being lukewarm to being supportive. And if you look back through history, that's not an unusual set of circumstances. And I was constantly pushing the envelope, constantly saying, I'm not going to do this. There's no way you can make me do it. And forcing the other guy to take you to the courts or whatever, but constantly doing that. So you're never, ever seen as a soft touch. For example, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Gibraltar. The British government has agreed to a deal in Gibraltar. And I hope there's somebody from Spain in your group on Saturday, on Friday and Saturday.
From Catalonia, not from Spain.
Well, terrific, because I'm sure
there we go.
For them, this will be even funnier than what I'm just about to describe. David Cameron, of blessed memory, sat down with the Spanish authorities to cut a deal for Gibraltar. Remember, Gibraltar voted 98% to remain in the EU. This is what he ended up with, that Gibraltar will now be part, for all purposes, of the Schengen area. What that means is people from Spain, Germany, Poland, Ireland, Italy will be able to go into Gibraltar without showing their passports, even though it's
Which
still
is great. Which is great, yeah, good for them.
But one group will not be able to do that, and that's people from the UK. So we've got a situation where a British colony
insane.
It's completely insane. It is completely insane.
But also, can we just, because Gibraltar's got that special deal. Northern Ireland's got the best of both worlds, where they've got a effectively single market, and their economy is booming despite Tory austerity and despite everything that they've done, because they've got that access to the single market. Now, Scotland is the UK nation that voted by far the most to remain. The Scottish government tried to be constructive, right? In the first few years of the process, Nicola Sturgeon was going around to David Cameron and Theresa May saying, look, let's agree a compromise here. Let's get a special deal for Scotland. And we got nothing, right? Nada. So I think that also shows the sort of contempt for Scotland at the heart of Westminster. Get back in your box, you've had your cereal. And yeah, that's the reality that we're dealing with. That's the situation. But I think we also have to be honest and pragmatic in that a lot of people at the moment, if you look at the polling, don't see independence as the top priority. And we can't blame them. That's just where we're at, right? I mean, independence hasn't been the top priority for the electorate for a while. So even though yes is at 50%, 48% consistently, it's slipped down people's attention because folk maybe don't believe that it's coming. They don't think it's imminent. They don't think it's the most important thing. So that's why I'm saying that if you govern well and if you improve people's lives in the here and now through devolution, and you always link it back to independence with rhetoric, and you always show that, look, this is how much more we could do. And if we have a network of people and messengers reinforcing that, including in Europe as well, where people are saying, look, Scotland should be back in the EU. Scotland can be independent. Look, we're from Denmark. We're independent. So should Scotland. If we can have that strategy and the good government that accompanies it, I think we can go far. And, I get it. So I'm really active in my SNP branch, and I'm really active in sort of different spaces where I'm the youngest person in the room. And obviously, folk that are older than me have been active in the movement a lot of the time for longer than me. I mean, I've been active since 2013, but 11 years is nothing compared to 40, 50, 60. And there's a lot of folk that are impatient, and I get it. I would be as well. I'm impatient. Yeah. I want independence tomorrow. But I think it's so important as well to reflect and think about what the nation thinks as well, and how do we tap into that instead of trying to blame the nation for thinking wrong, right? And I think sometimes we in the yes movement have a tendency where
you're right. That's foolish. I mean, you never say to the elector, "You're an idiot."
Exactly.
You never say that.
Exactly. And you have to respect
calling yourself an idiot. That doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
But what you must do, it seems to me, is to be assertive. I think it's very hard for people from overseas, in particular, as I said earlier, to see a group of people who say they want something, but they're not assertive about it. I think that's the first step in convincing everybody that this is something you feel strongly about. In terms of independence and opinion polls, I wouldn't be terribly fussed about that, and I'll tell you why. I mean, at the very best that I can ever recall, independence came third in people's priorities. It's the way you express the question. For example, we did a survey back in 2014 on constitutions, and we asked people which countries have a written constitution, and only 51% of Scots could name one, and that was the United States. And we asked them, which other countries might have a constitution, and I think 32% said Ireland. I mean, it was pathetic, but that's a reflection of the sort of coverage that these issues get. And if the coverage of independence is very negative, but also if you give people a list of things that are concrete, as well as, and include amongst that list something which right now feels ephemeral to some people, i.e. independence, what is it? What does it consist of? Who's going to be in charge? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And you put on the same list hospitals, cost of living. Well, come on. I mean, if I was asked that question, I would put cost of living, NHS.
Exactly. And then our challenge really in the movement is always, every time we have a conversation with an undecided voter, is, look, hospitals are in a state, right? Hospitals are in a mess. Why are they in a mess? Because of Labour PFI, because of Tory austerity, because of underfunding, and because of the fact that the UK spends the least on health compared to other countries, even though other countries have a paid-for system. Our NHS is being dismantled piece by piece. I mean, at least in England it is. West Streeting is planning to use more private providers in England. That has an effect on Scotland, even though we're devolved. So, link it back to independence. Say that without these Westminster governments, without PFI, without austerity, we can do things differently, right? Cost of living crisis. Again, if Scotland could borrow to invest in its infrastructure, to generate more wealth from our green energy, which is being underused, if Scotland could have a different sort of economy, which puts people first and has a well-being approach instead of the sort of massive focus on GDP and bankers' bonuses, again, that means something to folk, right? If people feel like they can get richer with independence, they'll back it. So it's substance, and it's injecting real meaning to things when talking to real people. Because I think a lot of the time we exist in these bubbles, right? In filter bubbles. That's a big thing. So social media. I mean, most of my friends are pro-independence. Most of my friends are sympathetic to the SNP, and it means that you don't exchange views with people that you disagree with very often, unless you chap doors, right? If you go canvassing, if you chap doors, I love chapping doors. You get that perspective of people that you maybe don't normally get on your everyday basis. But really, if there is one message, if there's one takeaway from me that I always say to people, just listen. Take the time to listen to people that disagree with you and that think differently. Because I think it's with that respect, it's with that, if we give people the time of day that we disagree with, and then quietly and gently persuade them that things can be better.
Let me give you an example of where Scotland could have moved differently and perhaps put down a marker. Free ports. Now, the EU has very, very clear restrictions on free ports. It does not allow them to be run by private enterprise because it feels that's a mistake. Scotland acceded to that when asked by Westminster. Would that not have been a golden opportunity to say, look, as long as it's run the way it's run in the EU, we're happy to go along with, or we will consider free ports. Instead of that, it seems to have gone exactly the opposite, which is, yeah, we'll take the Westminster model and use that.
Yeah, I mean, the free ports, I don't like it. I don't trust it. I think it's a kind of backhanded way to undermine workers' rights. It includes my area as well.
Yeah.
North, I mean, stretching all the way from Grangemouth to Kirkcaldy. And I think that there's a lot of damage that can come from it. I think there's some opportunities from it, undoubtedly, in the short term. I think it might bring a bit of a boost in manufacturing and jobs, and all of that is a good thing. But I think the philosophy of undermining workers' rights and kind of, bringing down taxes to attract companies and be ruthless with it is not ideal. And I think, look, again, the Scottish government didn't really have much of a choice here. I mean, the free ports were imposed by Westminster either way, and you either sort of, I guess, take it or leave it, right? But I'm not sure. I'm not exactly clued up.
I know that. I mean, it would have been an ideal opportunity to say, I'll tell you what, we're not against the principle of it, but it has to be done our way, right? Your way doesn't work. We're going to do it differently. That's the whole point of devolution, surely. It's not to accept as gospel what somebody at Westminster and the Treasury thinks, but rather to say, I'll tell you what, we'll have a look at this. If we decide to do it, we'll do it our way. But we may decide not to do it at all, but we'll get back to you on that. But why rush to accept a model which may be so deeply flawed that it acts against the interests of the very people you're there to serve? To me, it makes absolutely no sense.
I have to say, like, I am skeptical of free ports. I don't think we should have them. I think it'd be worth asking someone from the Scottish government or a minister.
Well, I would love to have. We've invited.
I do not know what the process.
We've invited the First Minister to come on the show, and perhaps he'd be kind enough to do that and help us understand why. Because you're right, it's unfair to ask you a strategic question of that nature. But nonetheless, as an independent supporter, I think it is fair, and you've expressed your concerns, and I appreciate that. I know we don't have a lot of your time because I know you've got another appointment coming up. But
SNP Dunfermline branch, I'm speaking there.
Right.
I'm going to have to head there in 5 minutes.
And they're lucky to have you. But in the time that remains, could you say a few words about the EU elections that are coming up and why people in Scotland should be interested in what happens on June the 6th and 9th this year?
So June the 6th is the time when the EU is voting in the European Parliament elections. Obviously, it's the first election that Scotland isn't taking part in because of Brexit. You might remember that election that we had in 2019 when we elected MEPs for just a couple of months before they got taken out of the EU.
Yep.
And And look, this is really important because the EU is talking a lot about enlargement just now. And you've got Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, who's talking about enlargement in the Balkans, in Moldova, in Ukraine. And, we want Scotland to be part of that conversation. I think it's very, very clear that Scotland's got a lot to contribute to Europe. I think we can offer a lot of good ideas. Look at the far right rising in Europe everywhere, from Germany to France, to Italy to Sweden. In Scotland, we're lucky enough that we don't have a parliamentary far right. So, I mean, a lot of the Tory party down south has become far right. They've taken over Farage's positions. In Scotland, the Scottish Tories are a wee bit more moderate, although they take their orders from their bosses in London. And it's really important to show to Europe that Scotland, with independence in the EU, can be that firewall against the far right, can be a progressive beacon, can be offering solutions to Europe-wide problems, can be a global player, can be on the stage. And I think, look, if we don't reach out the hand of friendship, right? If we don't do that proactive work and say to them, look, we want to be part of Europe, right? This wasn't our Brexit. This is not ours, right? We're different. Then hopefully we'll be listened to, and hopefully these European parties will accept Scotland's right to choose and advocate for it.
Here's a thought for a discussion at the weekend. Amongst the groups that you are familiar with and plugged into, have a mock election on June the 6th and say Scotland's going to vote, even if it's purely vestigial. Nonetheless, the principle remains that we would not have left the EU. And this would be a symbolic way of saying we still see ourselves intellectually, if not physically. And we still see ourselves intellectually and emotionally wedded to the EU. And this would be a symbolic way of saying that. Now, granted, all sorts of opposition groups will say, what a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. But you're being symbolic. You're throwing the tea into Boston Harbor.
No, exactly. I like that. I like that analogy. And Boston Harbor is a wee while away, but maybe we can put some coffee in Burnt Island Harbor.
Whatever. It's something that says, if we were still part of the EU, these are the things that we would like to see happen.
I love that. Love that idea. It's a good shout.
Yeah. Well, I know you have to go. You've got about
2 more minutes. Three more minutes.
Would you like to comment on anything that we haven't discussed to date that you would like, a point or two that you would like to make, Olaf, before you go?
I think just a final point really is, look, please support our work. I mean, I have started this big strategic mission for the Young Scots for Independence to engage internationally. I would want the party to do this as well, to be honest. I would want the SNP to do that work and not the YSI, because we're volunteers. The party should be taking that work forward. And I'm lobbying very hard for the SNP to establish a sort of international committee, an international unit, where all the different strands of international work, whether it's MPs, MSPs, Angus Robertson, the First Minister, can come together into a single space to discuss exactly what the strategy is, how we can be more assertive, how we can be more ruthless in pursuing those relationships.
Absolutely.
What are the key partners that we want to build, and through that have a sort of trickle of supporters among members of European parliaments, members of national parliaments, coming out for Scotland's right to choose. And that would generate some much needed sort of positive morale as well. So please support our work. We're doing it. We're bringing, a lot of promising young international leaders to Stirling. If you want to come along, please come along. The links have been posted in the comments. Or you can just check out the social media of Young Scots for Independence. And if you have a couple of bob to spare, I know it's very, very difficult, obviously financially, in the cost of living crisis, but if you have some money to spare, we're running a crowdfunder as well to meet our costs. We still haven't met a basic cost for the conference. We're a couple of £100 short in terms of venue hire, AV hire, and the hostel. So if you could help, that'd be amazing. And obviously help Independence Live as well. We need new media desperately in Scotland. We can see Unionist media pulling all the old tricks and trying to stop Scotland's voice being heard. So please support Indie Live as well.
Yeah, good. Thanks very much, Olaf. We need to let you go now.
All right, cheers.
Give our best to everyone in Dunfermline, please.
Take care.
Take care. Bye. Well, there you are, folks. A very eloquent guy in Olaf talking about the importance of the youth vote, the importance of what they're doing at the weekend. Olaf's right. I mean, I wouldn't expect the Unionist media to expend any great effort covering the conference. That would be too much to ask, because right now, in particular, they don't see the SNP as winners. The owners of the media tend to be swayed by whom they think might form the next government. And most of the smart money, in fact, most of the dumb money as well, is on Keir Starmer. And because of the grossly over-centralised nature of the UK, that means that the commentariat will take the view that whatever is happening south of the border will be reflected north. I'm not so sure that it will. I think, as Olaf says, the expectation perhaps in the SNP ranks too is that a number of seats will be lost. But having said that, I suspect the bulk will be retained. There may be a few wayward Tories who become defenestrated also because of the deep unpopularity of the present government. But then the new government, which takes office right after that, which again, as I say, most people expect it to be a Labour government. The likelihood is that, as I said earlier, it will fail. I say that not with any great joy, frankly, and with some real sadness. But the reality is that if you pursue the same policies as the guys who were there before you, and they failed, in what world are you going to succeed? I mean, it makes no sense. And what they will do, they will almost certainly introduce cuts across the NHS. They will privatise large parts of the NHS because they believe wrongly that private enterprise and people's health mix. They do in some cases, in very particular cases. For example, we don't want government necessarily involved in pharmaceuticals, but at the same time, the disbursement of those pharmaceuticals should be in the hands of the people rather than some private organisation, or as they plan to do in the NHS in England, is to subcontract GPs to people appointed by some accountancy company, perhaps. It just doesn't make sense. You have to ask yourself, if you or a member of your family were poorly and sick and ailing, ideally you would want them to be seen by a GP and as quickly as possible. If somebody comes along and says to you, we've got this guy who was working in some other occupation, not medical, but we've given him a cheat sheet. And when you or your relatives turn up to be interviewed, you won't be seen by a GP. It'll be this guy, and he's got the cheat sheet, and he will ask you these questions. And if you tick the right boxes, you might then subsequently get a chance to see a GP and get the medical attention you require. It's nuts. It's really nuts. But that's what they've got planned. And they will implement that, by the way. And they will implement it in the foolish notion that they're saving money. Well, the same philosophy produced the privatisation of water in England and Wales. It produced the privatisation of the railways. I mean, what a huge success those have been. It's just by the grace of good government that Scotland was spared effluent in its waterways, where people just cannot go swimming. And now we find out that one water company in the south is warning its customers not to drink the water. This is third world stuff. If I had appeared on your screens, say 2-3 years ago, and said, anybody in the UK will receive a message saying, don't drink the water, you would say, no, you've got it wrong, John. You must be talking about some other place, maybe Rwanda, maybe the Congo, where folks, there's not been investment and where there's been no spend on public health and public services. Billions have been spent by the water companies. It's gone to the owners, and the owners are not here. Why should they care? It is. If you sat down to try and work out the worst possible set of circumstances for a country, you could scarcely contrive to come up with what we have just now, which is frankly beyond appalling. And you know something? It's based primarily upon a lack of moral leadership. Yeah, that's not something you hear every day, but it's the truth. You know, if you've got a bunch of people who are amoral, in other words, lacking in any sort of moral compass, this is where you end up. This is what Westminster is, in large part. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but the SNP group isn't like that. I agree. But the reality is, who cares? They're a minority. They're number 3, but they don't count for anything. Literally. I mean, it's not the fault of the individuals. It's the fault of the system. But if you don't complain about the system in the sense of making sure it stops working against you, then effectively you're colluding with it. You're saying, I hate this, but you know something? At the end of the day, I'll go along with it. Well, maybe that time has passed, as we discussed with Olaf. Maybe the time for saying, we'll go along with it because you're in charge legally, you're in charge. But look at the things that were once legal. You know, countries make things legal. It doesn't mean they're ethical. It doesn't mean they're moral, you know. I mean, in Germany in the 30s, euthanasia was legal. Concentration camps were legal. If you complained about any of those things, you were acting illegally, you know. So, I mean, the fact that some government somewhere says, this is what you have to do, oh, come on, you know. We all have a moral imperative here. You know, this is important. We can't just walk away and say, I'll tell you what, because it's lawful, it must be okay. Well, you know, no. If it's wrong, it's wrong. But it's not just a question of saying it's wrong. You have to back it up. You have to say, I'm not going to go along with this because effectively, if I do, I'm endorsing what you're saying. I'm endorsing an immoral act. I'm endorsing, for example, take Rwanda, where they're going to take unfortunate people and ship them off to another country because they can't think of a better way to handle things. Well, here's a suggestion. Why don't you spend some money in the countries where these people came from so that they don't feel quite so disadvantaged? Oh, it's going to cost too much. It's going to cost too much? Do you know what it's going to cost to ship people to Rwanda? And they say, oh, but we've got volunteers. Yeah, you've got volunteers, but who are the volunteers? Somebody volunteers, they go off to Rwanda, they got a ticket out there, they take one look at the place and they say, I want to come back. What are you going to do? You're going to say, no, you have to stay there. What if the person moves to the Congo, where there's a war raging? You know, there's a war raging in the country beside Rwanda. Can you believe that? Where's the morality of sending somebody to a war zone because you don't agree with their immigrant status? I mean, these are people, asylum seekers. They're people who have fled their countries in large part. You know, I mean, and your moral response to that is to say, well, damn you, because I might lose a few votes on the far right to Nigel Farage and his mates, I'm going to penalise you. What? I mean, yeah, just crazy, absolutely crazy. And if you don't protest and if you don't say it's wrong, then effectively you're going along with it, right? And I think we talked in the programme about with Olaf about, you know, somewhat flippantly about what happened in the United States and the guys who dressed up as Indians threw the tea into the Boston Harbour. But it was a flippant action, but it was a way of saying, up with this, we will not put. Now, they've been talking in the various governments in the 13 states that what the British government was doing was wrong. They kept saying it over and over again. What was the British government's reaction? 1775. They say, well, who cares what you think? You know, the government has passed a law and you've got to pay the tax. Well, we don't want to pay the tax. Well, too bad. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is actions have consequences. And if they don't have consequences, effectively, you're colluding in the action. And that's the reality of it. You know, that's the bare bones of it. You've decided that, well, words are cheap. I can stand up and deplore and deplore and deplore. But at the end of the day, if they tell me I've got to do it, I've got to do it. Yeah. I mean, what can you do? That's the law. Yeah. Well, I say, you know, you make it difficult. You just say, well, look what happened in Glasgow. They said this asylum seeker has to go. right? Hundreds of people turned up and said, no, they're not going. They're not going. The law was that they had to go. And yet all these Glaswegians from elsewhere turned up and said, no, we don't agree. And furthermore, we're going to make it impossible for you to do what you say you're going to do, even though the people who went to remove these good folks were acting lawfully. So I'm not proposing anything. I'm not suggesting anything that hasn't already been done. That's the reality of it. As folks say, it was Ken Muir Street. Life is not about standing on the sidelines, deploring. It really isn't. If you reach the end of your days, and goodness gracious me, I'm a good deal older than almost all of you, perhaps combined. Reach the end of your days, you cannot, in all conscience, say to yourself, "Oh, well, I deplored it." You what? Come on, give me a break. You deplored it. What did you do about it? Oh, I deplored it. You deplored it? Come on. Yeah. You can't go to your grave saying, I'm the great deplorer. No. If people do bad things, you say it's bad things, and the rest of us shouldn't go along with bad things, right? And until we have a government of our own, right, it seems to me that's a necessary and essential way forward. Otherwise, you're agreeing with it. You're saying you don't, but you're actually acting as that you do. And that doesn't make any sense, because if you do that, what you're doing is, this is the great sadness of all of this. What you're doing is you're corrupting yourself by saying one thing and doing another. That's just not healthy. And nobody should do that to themselves. And it's important to create that distinction, right? And it's important for the country as well, not to say one thing and do another. So it's not a question of not deploring. You do deplore, of course you do. But what you do is you back up with some form of action, however feeble, however symbolic. As I said to Olaf, why not on June 6th have a symbolic election to the European Parliament? Why not? The Scottish people said they wanted to continue it. They were dragged out against their will. That was deplored. Oh, why not do something symbolic? It's just like throwing the tea into Boston Harbor. It's the same damn thing, It's not going to change anything, right? That's what everyone thinks. But hey, who's to know? The kids who dressed up as Indians, who threw the tea into Boston Harbor, didn't seriously think they were going to change anything. But they said, we have to do something, because we've had all this months and months of deploring. We're going to do something. Daft though it may be, symbolic though it probably was. But my word, didn't it change the world? Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have, talking to Olaf. We've got another bunch of great guests lined up. As you can see on the screen here, we've got Denise Finlay next week, special guest, who'll be talking about the new iApp. That's AYE app. And it's a unique online facility, an app that you can download for independent supporters to keep in touch and to know what's happening. This is about doing things, and it's where people can share. And this show, for example, is typical. Rather than just sitting there saying, "Oh, nothing much can be done." Hey, we're doing something. We're having a show. We're talking to people, a whole range of people right across the board. And if Ash Riggin would like to join us one night, and John Swinney on a separate night, and fine, great, we'd love to see them. Because it seems to me that would be one way they'd be backing words with action. You're welcome, everyone. And remember, the world is a dangerous place, but not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. So to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, look after each other, take care, and don't forget the Crowdfunder. Good night.